Mara woke to her mother's voice cutting through the thin bedroom wall. "Just get her into the dress, Margaret. I don't care if it fits properly." He's never seen her. Once the vows are done, it's his problem. Mara lay still on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams she'd memorized over 23 years of living in this house. The wood grain formed shapes if you looked long enough. A dog. A mountain. A woman running. She never ran. What if he refuses? That was her younger sister, Catherine, whose voice always carried that particular mix of concern and relief. Concern for the family's reputation. Relief that she wasn't the one being shipped off to a stranger. He won't refuse. Men like Thomas Garrett don't turn down free land and a wife capable of hard work. Your father made sure the offer was generous. Generous! Mara rolled the word around in her mind like a stone in her mouth. They were paying a man to take her. The land her grandfather left her, 60 acres of river-bottom soil that every rancher in 3 counties wanted, was the dowry. She was just the unfortunate condition attached to the deed. She sat up slowly. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and she heard her mother's conversation stop abruptly. Footsteps approached her door. "You're awake." Her mother didn't phrase it as a question. Ruth Whitlock never asked questions when statements would do. She pushed into the room without knocking, carrying the crimson dress like a battle flag. "Put this on. We have 2 hours before the ceremony." Mara looked at the dress. It was new, probably the most expensive thing her parents had ever bought her, but the color was wrong, too bold. Too attention-grabbing for a woman who'd spent her whole life trying to disappear.
"Mama, I was thinking maybe the blue dress would—" "The blue dress makes you look wider. We discussed this." Ruth laid the crimson fabric across the bed with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. "This color draws the eye upward, away from proportions." There it was. That word her mother used instead of saying what she meant. "You're too big, too tall, too much, too—" Mara had stopped arguing about her body somewhere around age 14, when she shot up past every boy in school and her mother started looking at her like a problem that needed solving rather than a daughter who needed raising. "Where's Papa?" Mara asked. "At the church, making sure everything is arranged properly. Thomas Garrett arrived last night. Stayed at the hotel." Ruth smoothed the dress, not looking at her daughter. "He's a good man, Mara. Owns a ranch south of here. 42 years old, been widowed for 3 years. He needs a wife, and you need to be settled." Settled. As if she were dust that needed to stop swirling around and land somewhere permanent. "Have you met him?" "Your father has. Says he's respectable. That's all that matters." "And he knows what I look like?" Ruth's hand stilled on the fabric. "We sent him a description." "What kind of description?" "The honest kind." Her mother finally looked up, and for just a moment something almost like guilt flickered across her face. "You're strong, capable, good with numbers and animals. You can read and write better than most women. Those are the things that matter in a marriage. Those are the things that matter to a man who needs a work partner, not a wife," Mara thought, but didn't say. What was the point? The decision had been made. The land had been offered. Thomas Garrett had accepted, and in 2 hours she would walk down an aisle toward a man who'd never seen her face and had agreed to marry her anyway because the compensation was worth the risk. Ruth left the dress and walked toward the door. She paused at the threshold, her back to Mara. "You could be happy, you know, if you tried." Then she was gone. Mara sat alone with the crimson dress and the weight of that final statement. If you tried. As if happiness were just a matter of effort, and she'd been too lazy to reach for it all these years. She stood and walked to the small mirror propped on her dresser. The face looking back wasn't ugly exactly. Just ordinary. Brown eyes, strong jaw, dark hair that never curled the right way no matter how much Catherine fussed with it. And beneath the face, a body that had always felt like an apology she was forced to carry around, tall, broad-shouldered, solid in ways that made men look past her and mothers whisper about unfortunate luck. She touched the mirror's cold surface. "You could be happy," she whispered to her reflection, "if you were someone else." The wagon ride to church was silent except for the creak of wheels and her father's occasional throat clearing. Mara sat between her parents, the crimson dress tight across her ribs, restricting her breathing in a way that felt symbolic. Catherine and her younger brother James rode in the back, whispering. Mara caught fragments. "Never even seen her. Papa says the land is worth." Probably relieved just to have her, she closed her eyes and tried to disappear inside herself. a skill she'd perfected over years of family dinners, where her presence felt like an inconvenience everyone was too polite to mention directly. The church appeared through the dust, a white-painted building that looked too clean for a frontier town like Dry Creek, where everything else was weathered gray by wind and time. Wagons and horses crowded the yard. The entire town had turned out to witness Mara Whitlock finally become someone else's responsibility. "Remember," her father said as he helped her down from the wagon, his grip firm on her arm. "Be grateful. Thomas Garrett is doing our family a considerable kindness."
Kindness. That word again, dressed up to disguise a transaction. "Yes, Papa." Inside the church, the pews were packed. Mara felt the weight of every eye as she walked through the door. Women in their Sunday best, children squirming, men with their hats in their laps, all of them there to see the Whitlock girl finally get married off. Mrs. Henderson leaned toward Mrs. Cooper and whispered something behind her hand. Both women looked at Mara and smiled in that particular way women smile when they're being cruel while pretending to be kind. Catherine appeared at her elbow, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers someone had hastily assembled. "You look nice," Catherine said, but her voice carried the hollow ring of a lie told out of obligation. "Where is he?" Mara asked. Catherine's eyes darted toward the front of the church. "At the altar. I haven't seen him yet. Papa's been keeping him in the side room." The organ began to play. Not a wedding march, but something slower, more somber. Someone had chosen funeral music for her wedding, probably an accident. Probably not. Ruth appeared and began fussing with Mara's dress, tugging the fabric, adjusting the neckline, trying to make 10 pounds of problems fit into a 5-pound dress. "Stand up straight," she hissed. "And for heaven's sake, smile. You look like you're walking to the gallows." "Aren't I?" But Mara straightened her spine and forced her mouth into something resembling a smile, and when her father offered his arm, she took it. The doors to the sanctuary opened. Every head turned. Mara saw them all at once, the entire congregation, their faces reflecting everything from curiosity to pity to barely concealed amusement. The Hendersons, the Coopers, the Blackwell family, who'd once tried to court her off to their cousin until they saw her in person. The sheriff and his wife, the banker. The teacher who'd once told her mother that Mara was too clever for a girl who'll just end up married anyway. They all watched her begin the long walk down the aisle. And at the end of that aisle, standing at the altar in a dark suit that looked new and uncomfortable, was Thomas Garrett. He had his back to her. Mara's father pulled her forward, step by step, their shoes echoing on the wooden floor. The organ music swelled. Someone coughed. A child whispered something and was shushed. They were halfway down the aisle when Thomas Garrett turned around. Mara watched his face change in real time. First, confusion, as if he wasn't sure who he was looking at. Then recognition, slowly connecting the woman walking toward him with the description he'd been given. Then something cold and hard settled into his features, and Mara knew with absolute certainty what was about to happen. Her feet kept moving because her father's grip on her arm left no choice. 3 rows from the front, Thomas Garrett's face went from pale to red. 2 rows away, his jaw clenched. 1 row away, he raised his hand. "Stop!" The organ cut off mid-note. The silence that followed was so complete that Mara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her father's grip tightened. "Thomas, you lied to me." Thomas Garrett's voice carried across the church, with the clarity of a man who'd made his decision and didn't care who heard it. His eyes fixed on Mara with open disgust. "You said she was sturdy and capable. You said she was a good match for ranch life. You didn't mention—" He gestured at her, a sweeping motion that encompassed everything from her height to her build to the crimson dress that now felt like a spotlight on every inadequacy she'd ever been made to feel. "This," he finished. The word hung in the air like smoke. Mara's father released her arm and stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. "Thomas, we can discuss—" "There's nothing to discuss." Thomas looked past Mara to address the entire congregation. "I came here in good faith to marry a woman I was told would be suitable for a rancher's wife. I was deceived. I won't chain myself to a mistake, and I won't be embarrassed into honoring an agreement made under false pretenses." Someone in the back pews laughed, a short, sharp bark that was quickly muffled. But the damage was done. The laughter spread like fire through dry grass. Not everyone joined in, but enough did that the sound surrounded Mara from all sides. Tittering, giggling, the cruel kind of amusement people indulge in when someone else's humiliation makes them feel better about their own lives. Mara stood frozen. The bouquet of wildflowers slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft rustle. She was vaguely aware of her mother's sharp intake of breath, her father's face going red, Catherine's hand covering her mouth. But mostly she was aware of the laughter and the eyes, and Thomas Garrett's back as he turned away from her and walked toward the side door as if she were something unpleasant he needed to escape quickly. She had survived 23 years of subtle rejection, quiet disappointment, and carefully worded insults disguised as concern. She had never been rejected like this. Not publicly, not cruelly, not in front of everyone who'd spent her whole life making her feel like she was too much and not enough all at once. Her legs wouldn't move. She stood in the aisle, drowning in laughter and silence, and the horrible realization that this moment would follow her for the rest of her life. She would be the girl who got left at the altar. The bride nobody wanted. The woman so unbearable that a man took one look and fled. Then, cutting through the chaos, a voice from the back of the church. "I'll marry her." The laughter stopped. Every head turned. Mara couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she'd just heard. Heavy footsteps echoed down the aisle. Slow, deliberate, the sound of boots on wood. She watched as a man emerged from the back pews and walked toward her. He was tall, taller than she was, which almost never happened. Broad-shouldered in a way that came from actual work rather than good tailoring. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face weathered by sun and wind, and something deeper that had nothing to do with weather. He wore work clothes rather than Sunday best. A simple shirt, worn trousers, a leather vest that looked like it had survived a decade of hard use. Mara had never seen him before in her life. The man walked past her without looking at her and addressed her father directly. "I'll marry your daughter. Right now. No payment necessary." Mara's father blinked rapidly, as if trying to process a language he didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry, who?" "Caleb Mercer." A ripple of recognition moved through the congregation. Mara heard the name whispered, passed from pew to pew like currency. Caleb Mercer, the rancher from the Northern Territory, the one who lost his family, the one who lives alone past the ridge. Sheriff Crawford stood up from his seat near the front. "Mercer, I appreciate the gesture, but—" "It's not a gesture." Caleb's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "I'm making an offer. Your daughter needs a husband. I need a wife. Seems straightforward." "You don't even know her," Ruth said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Don't need to." Caleb finally turned to look at Mara, and his eyes were darker than she'd first thought. Not brown, but something closer to black. "She's been standing in front of this whole town being humiliated for the last 5 minutes, and she hasn't collapsed. That tells me everything I need to know." Mara found her voice, though it came out rough. "You're serious. Don't make offers I'm not serious about. You don't know anything about me. No, you're stronger than that coward who just ran out the door." Someone in the congregation gasped at the bluntness of the statement. Thomas Garrett's brother stood up from the front pew, his face red. "Now, wait just a minute. Your brother humiliated this woman in front of everyone she's ever known," Caleb said, without raising his voice. "I don't wait for men like that." The sheriff stepped into the aisle, positioning himself between Caleb and the altar. "Mercer, I'm grateful for what you're trying to do, but this is highly irregular. We don't even know if Miss Whitlock wants—" "Does she want to stay here?" Caleb interrupted. "In this town with these people after what just happened?" The sheriff opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Mara. Everyone looked at Mara. And Mara realized with sudden, crushing clarity that this was the only choice she had left. She could refuse Caleb Mercer's offer and walk out of this church unmarried, humiliated, the subject of gossip and pity for the rest of her life. Or she could marry a complete stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere like something from a fever dream. Both options were terrifying, but one option at least had the dignity of being unknown. She looked at Caleb Mercer, this hard-faced stranger who'd defended her more in 5 minutes than her own family had in 23 years. "All right," she heard herself say. "I'll marry you." Her mother made a sound like something being strangled. Her father's face went through several colors before settling on resigned confusion. The preacher, who'd been standing at the altar through all of this looking thoroughly bewildered, cleared his throat. "I suppose we should proceed then." Caleb nodded once and walked to the altar. He didn't offer Mara his arm, didn't try to help her, just walked and assumed she'd follow. So she did. Her legs felt disconnected from her body as she walked past her parents, past Catherine's shocked face, past the Hendersons and the Coopers, and all the people who'd spent years making her feel small. She stood at the altar next to a man whose last name she'd learned 30 seconds ago. The preacher fumbled with his Bible, clearly thrown by the sudden change in Groom. Should I start from the beginning or just do the vows? Caleb said. Skip the rest. So the preacher skipped to the vows. He asked Caleb if he took Mara to be his lawfully wedded wife, and Caleb said, I do, in the same tone someone might use to confirm the time of day. He asked Mara if she took Caleb to be her lawfully wedded husband, and Mara said, I do, because what else was she going to say? Then by the power vested in me by the territory of— Are there rings? Caleb interrupted. The preacher blinked. Thomas Garrett had a ring, but he took it with him when he— Caleb reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. No ornament, no decoration, just a smooth circle of metal that looked old and well-worn. He held it out to Mara. She stared at it. Is that— Belonged to my wife, Caleb said quietly. She's dead. Been dead for 3 years. Ring's just sitting in a drawer. She'd want it used. The church was so silent that Mara could hear the wind outside. She took the ring with shaking fingers. It was warm from being in his pocket, and heavier than she'd expected. Caleb took her hand. His grip was calloused and firm, and held it steady while she slid the ring onto her own finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. By the power vested in me, the preacher said quickly, clearly eager to finish before anything else went wrong. I now pronounce you man and wife. He paused, then added weakly, You may kiss the bride? Caleb looked at Mara. His expression was unreadable. No, he said simply. Then he turned and walked back down the aisle toward the exit. Mara stood at the altar, wearing a dead woman's ring, married to a stranger, unsure whether she'd just been saved or claimed. The congregation sat in stunned silence. Her mother's face had gone pale. Her father looked like he was trying to calculate whether this outcome was better or worse than the first one. Mara looked at the ring on her finger, then at the church full of people who'd laughed at her humiliation. Then she turned and followed her husband out into the sunlight. Outside the church, Caleb was already untying a horse from the hitching post, a big buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes and a crooked white blaze down its face. Mara stopped on the church steps, suddenly aware that she had no idea what happened next. Did she go home and pack her things? Did she say goodbye to her family? What were the rules for a situation like this? Caleb swung up into the saddle and looked down at her. You coming? Now? Right now? You have somewhere else to be? Mara glanced back at the church doors. Inside, she could hear voices rising in argument, her father's baritone, the sheriff's careful mediation, her mother's sharp tone cutting through both. I need to get my things, she said. My clothes, I'll buy you new things. But my books, they'll send them. Caleb gathered the reins. Or they won't. Either way, you're not going back in theirs. There was something final in the way he said it, as if the matter had already been decided and arguing would be pointless. Mara looked at the crimson dress she was wearing, the dress chosen to hide what her mother considered flaws, the dress she'd worn while being rejected in front of the entire town. She hated it, every stitch of it. I can't ride in this, she said. Caleb studied her for a moment, then swung down from his horse and pulled a knife from his belt. Mara took a step back. What are you— He grabbed the hem of her dress and cut upward in one smooth motion, slicing through the fabric from hem to knee. What are you doing? Mara tried to pull away, but he was already working on the other side, cutting the restrictive fabric into something more practical. Making it so you can ride without falling off, he said. You can buy a new one when we get to town next month. For now, this'll do. He stepped back and examined his work. The dress now looked like something that had survived a fight with a wolf, but Mara found she could move her legs freely for the first time all day. Caleb put his knife away and mounted his horse again. Church keeps a wagon team for funerals. We'll borrow one of their horses. Borrow? Sheriff knows where to find me when they want it back. Before Mara could protest, Caleb rode to the small stable behind the church and emerged moments later leading a brown mare with a white sock on one hoof. He brought the mare to the church steps and held out his hand to Mara. You know how to mount? I'm not crippled. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Caleb's face. Didn't think you were. Mara gathered the ruined dress, put her foot in the stirrup, and pulled herself up onto the mare's back. The horse shifted under her weight, but Caleb kept a steady hand on the bridle until Mara found her balance. She'd ridden before. Her grandfather had taught her when she was young, before he died and the horses were sold off. But it had been years, and her body felt wrong in the saddle, too big, too awkward. Hold the reins like this. Caleb adjusted her grip, his hands businesslike and impersonal. She's a steady mare. Won't spook easy. Just sit and follow me. The church doors opened behind them. Mara's father emerged, his face red, the sheriff right behind him. Now wait just a minute, her father called. We need to discuss. Caleb kicked his horse into motion. Mara's mare followed automatically, and suddenly they were moving, leaving the church and her father's protests behind in a cloud of dust. Mara looked back once. Her entire family stood on the church steps, her father angry, her mother stiff with disapproval, Catherine wide-eyed with something that might have been envy or horror. The congregation was spilling out behind them, everyone talking at once. Then Caleb took a turn, and the church disappeared behind a row of buildings, and Mara Whitlock, now Mara Mercer, she supposed, rode away from everything she'd ever known. They rode through the main street of Dry Creek in silence. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Mrs. Henderson dropped her shopping basket. The blacksmith paused mid-hammer. A group of children playing in the street scattered to let them pass. Everyone saw Mara in her butchered crimson dress, riding beside the mysterious rancher who'd married her out of nowhere. Tomorrow they would all talk about it. But by tomorrow, Mara would be gone. They rode north out of town, following a road that narrowed to a trail that eventually faded to nothing more than 2 ruts in the grass where wagon wheels had passed enough times to leave marks. The sun climbed higher. The dress that had felt suffocating in the church now let in too much air, and Mara found herself shivering despite the heat. She wrapped her arms around herself and focused on staying in the saddle. Caleb didn't speak. He rode slightly ahead, his back straight, his attention on the horizon as if he'd already forgotten she was there. After an hour, Mara's legs started aching. After 2 hours, her back joined in. She hadn't ridden in years, and her body was making sure she knew it. "How far is it?" she asked. "Another 4 hours." 4 hours. 4 more hours of this, and then what? A ranch somewhere beyond the ridge, owned by a man she didn't know, living a life she couldn't imagine. What kind of ranch? Cattle, mostly? Some horses? How big? Big enough? The conversation died. Caleb clearly wasn't interested in small talk, and Mara didn't have the energy to force it. They passed through open grassland that stretched toward distant mountains. The wind was constant, bending the tall grass in waves that looked like water. Hawks circled overhead. In the distance, Mara saw a herd of pronghorn antelope watching them pass before bolting away in long, bouncing strides. The land was bigger than anything around Dry Creek, emptier, more honest somehow. No buildings trying to impose order on it, no fences pretending to contain it, just grass and wind and sky going on forever. Around midday, Caleb reined in near a creek running cold and clear over smooth stones. He dismounted and let his horse drink. "Get down," he said to Mara. "Rest for 15 minutes. Mara tried to dismount gracefully and failed spectacularly. Her legs had gone stiff, and she half fell, half climbed down from the mare, catching herself against the horse's shoulder. Caleb was already kneeling by the creek, filling a canteen. He didn't offer to help her, didn't comment on her graceless landing, just filled the canteen and held it out. "Drink." Mara took it and drank. The water was shockingly cold, clean-tasting, nothing like the well water back home that always had a faint metallic edge. "Thank you." Caleb nodded and took the canteen back when she was done. He drank, refilled it, then sat on a flat rock and pulled dried meat from his saddlebag. He tore off a piece and handed it to Mara without a word. She took it and sat on another rock a few feet away, chewing the tough meat and trying to make sense of the day. This morning she'd woken up as Mara Whitlock, unwanted daughter. Now she was Mara Mercer, wife of a stranger, riding toward an unknown future. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Caleb looked at her. "Do what?" "Marry me. Defend me. You didn't have to." He was quiet for a long moment, chewing his meat, staring at the creek. "I was in town for supplies," he said finally. "Heard there was a wedding. Figured I'd watch, kill some time before the store opened. When I saw what was happening," he trailed off. "What?" "I saw someone strong enough to stand there and take it. Most people would have run. You didn't." "I couldn't move." "Still didn't run." He stood and brushed crumbs from his pants. "That's rare, strength like that." "I'm not strong. I'm just—" Mara searched for the right word. "Stuck. Same thing sometimes." He walked to his horse and checked the saddle, preparing to leave. Mara forced herself to her feet, ignoring the screaming protests from her thighs and lower back. "Rest time's over," Caleb said. "Mount up." This time Mara managed to get into the saddle without falling. Progress. They rode on. The sun was starting its descent when the ranch finally came into view. It sat in a wide valley surrounded by ridge lines, protected from the worst of the wind, but open enough to see approaching storms or visitors from miles away. The house was small, rough-cut logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, shuttered windows, a porch that looked like it had been built as an afterthought. Behind it stood a barn that had clearly received more care than the house, along with several corrals and outbuildings in various states of repair. Cattle dotted the surrounding hills, maybe 200 head, Mara guessed, though she'd never been good at counting distant animals. "This is it?" Caleb said unnecessarily. They rode into the yard. The mare Mara was riding whinnied, and a dog appeared from behind the barn, a large mixed-breed creature with mismatched eyes, one blue and one brown. The dog approached Caleb's horse, tail wagging cautiously. "That's Patch," Caleb said. "He's friendly unless you're a coyote." Caleb dismounted and started unsaddling his horse with efficient, practiced movements. Mara slid down from the mare, her legs trembling, and tried to copy what he was doing with his tack. "You know how to unsaddle?" Caleb asked. "I'm learning." He walked over and showed her how to unbuckle the cinch, where to store the saddle, how to check the mare's hooves for stones. His instructions were brief and clear, the words of someone who didn't have time to repeat himself. When the horses were seen to, Caleb walked to the house. Mara followed, unsure what else to do. Inside, the house was exactly what she expected. Sparse, functional, clean, but not decorated. A main room with a table, chairs, a wood stove, a bedroom visible through an open door, another small room that might have been meant for children or storage. Everything made from rough wood, nothing painted or adorned. It was the house of a man who didn't care about anything except necessity. Caleb lit a lantern as the sunlight faded. "You're tired. I can see it in how you're standing. Bedroom's through there. Take it." "Where will you sleep?" "Out here." He gestured to a bedroll stacked in the corner. "Used to the floor anyway." Mara looked at the bedroom door. "I don't want to take your bed." "Not mine anymore." "It's yours now. You're my wife." The word sounded strange coming from his mouth, formal, like a title rather than a relationship. "We should talk about what that means," Mara said. Caleb pulled down 2 tin plates from a shelf. "It means you live here. You're safe. Nobody will bother you." "But I don't what?" Mara felt her face heat. "I don't know what you expect from me." Caleb stopped and looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "I expect you to live your life. Help with the ranch if you want. Don't if you don't want. I'm not going to force you into anything, if that's what you're worried about. This is a practical arrangement. I needed a wife for legal reasons. Inheritance laws are easier with a marriage on record. You needed a way out of a bad situation. That's the deal." "That's all?" "That's all." Mara studied his face, looking for deception or hidden motives. She'd spent her whole life around people who said one thing and meant another. But Caleb's expression was as plain as his words, blunt, honest, take it or leave it. What people expect from marriage?" she asked carefully. "People can expect whatever they want. Doesn't mean we have to give it to them." He turned back to the stove and started building a fire. "There's bread in the cupboard and salt pork in the cold cellar. I'll make something simple tonight. You look like you're about to fall over." He was right. Mara's entire body was screaming for rest. The emotional weight of the day plus the physical demands of the ride had drained her completely. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb just nodded and went back to his fire building. Mara walked to the bedroom and pushed the door open. Inside was a simple bed with a thick quilt, a dresser with 3 drawers, a washstand with a pitcher and basin. The window looked out over the valley, and in the dying light she could see the ridgeline standing dark against the sunset. She sat on the bed. The mattress was firm, but not uncomfortable. The quilt smelled like cedar and something else, something that might have been another woman's perfume years ago. This was a dead woman's bed. Mara lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling. The wood beams were rough-hewn, not quite straight, held together with mortise joints and wooden pegs. Someone had built this house by hand, probably Caleb himself, probably for the wife he'd mentioned in the church. "Belonged to my wife. She's dead. Been dead for 3 years." The ring on Mara's finger felt suddenly heavy. She closed her eyes and tried to process the impossibility of the day. This morning she'd been the unwanted daughter preparing to marry a stranger. Now she was a different kind of unwanted, the stand-in bride, the replacement wife, the woman who'd been chosen not because anyone wanted her, but because she'd been convenient. Through the door, she heard Caleb moving around the kitchen, the clank of pots, the sizzle of fat on a hot pan, the scrape of a chair being pulled out. Ordinary sounds of a life that was now somehow hers. Mara lay in a dead woman's bed, wearing a dead woman's ring, married to a man who'd told her the truth in the most uncomfortably direct way possible. This is a practical arrangement. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something harder to name, something like grief for a loss she couldn't quite identify. Outside the window, the sun finished setting, and darkness claimed the valley. Mara Mercer closed her eyes and wondered who she was supposed to be now. Mara woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, rough beams instead of plaster. The light was wrong, too bright, coming from the wrong direction. Then memory crashed back, the church, the rejection, Caleb Mercer's unexpected offer, the long ride to this valley. She sat up slowly. Her body protested every movement. Muscles she'd forgotten existed now screamed their existence. Her thighs felt like someone had beaten them with sticks. Her lower back was a knot of pain. The axe sounds continued outside, steady and rhythmic. Mara looked down at herself. She was still wearing the butchered crimson dress, now wrinkled and dusty from the ride. She'd fallen asleep in it, too exhausted to do anything else. A knock on the door made her jump. "You awake?" Caleb's voice, muffled by the wood. "Yes." "There's water in the basin, bread and coffee on the table when you're ready." His footsteps retreated before she could respond. Mara stood carefully, testing her legs. They held barely. She walked to the washstand where someone, Caleb presumably, had filled the basin with clean water. She splashed her face, trying to wash away the fog of sleep and the strangeness of waking up in this place. In the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the ride, falling in tangled waves around her face. The crimson dress gaped open where Caleb had cut it. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked like someone who'd survived something. Maybe she had. Mara did what she could to make herself presentable, then walked into the main room. True to his word, Caleb had left bread and coffee on the table. The bread was hard, probably a few days old, but edible. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Through the window, she could see Caleb in the yard, splitting logs with mechanical precision. He'd removed his shirt in the morning heat, and Mara found herself studying the way his muscles moved under sun-darkened skin, not with attraction exactly, but with a kind of detached curiosity about the man she'd married. He was strong. That much was obvious. But there was something controlled about the way he worked, as if he'd learned to channel everything, anger, grief, whatever drove him, into physical labor. The axe came down, wood split. He set up another log. Repeat. Mara drank her coffee and wondered what she was supposed to do now. The answer came when Caleb walked in 20 minutes later, sweat-slicked and breathing hard. He poured himself water from a pitcher, drank it in one long pull, then looked at her. "You ride?" "I got here, didn't I?" "I mean really ride. Work cattle, rope, manage a horse that's not half asleep." "No." "You know how to shoot?" "No." "Butcher an animal? Tan leather? Repair tack?" "No." Caleb nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "All right, we start there then." "Start what?" "Teaching you how to survive out here." He grabbed his shirt from where he'd draped it over a chair and pulled it on. "This isn't town, Mara. If something happens to me, horse throws me, I break a leg, whatever, you need to be able to handle this place alone until help arrives. And help might not arrive for days." The casualness with which he discussed his potential death or injury was unsettling. "I can learn," Mara said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "Didn't say you couldn't. I'm just telling you what needs doing." He walked to a cabinet and pulled out worn leather gloves. "Put these on. We're starting with water." Hauling water, it turned out, was brutally simple and brutally hard. The well was 40 yards from the house, and each bucket weighed enough that Mara's arms shook after the first trip. Caleb showed her how to carry 2 buckets at once, balancing the weight, but even with his instructions, Mara could barely manage one at a time. "The animals need fresh water twice a day," Caleb explained, not unkindly. "More when it's hot. You'll build strength. Everyone does." He made it look easy, carrying 2 sloshing buckets as if they weighed nothing, dumping them into the trough near the barn where cattle came to drink. Mara tried again. Her arms trembled. Water splashed over the sides, soaking her already ruined dress. By the third trip, she wanted to quit. By the fifth, she wanted to cry. By the seventh, she was too angry to do either. "That's enough for now," Caleb said, taking the buckets from her. "You'll hurt yourself if you push too hard the first day." Mara wanted to argue, to prove she wasn't weak, but her hands were already blistering despite the gloves, and her shoulders felt like they'd been pulled from their sockets. "What's next?" she asked. Caleb studied her for a moment. "You always this stubborn? You always this blunt?" Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Gone so fast, Mara wasn't sure she'd seen it. Fair enough. Next is the chickens. The chicken coop was behind the barn, home to a dozen scraggly hens who eyed Mara with deep suspicion when she approached. One particularly aggressive bird, a speckled hen Caleb called General, charged at Mara's ankles the moment she stepped inside. "She's testing you," Caleb said from outside the coop. "Don't let her." "How do I not let her?" "Assert dominance. You're bigger than she is." Mara stared at the chicken, which stared back with beady, judgmental eyes. Then the bird charged again, and Mara did something she never thought she'd do. She charged back, arms spread wide, making herself as large as possible. The chicken retreated, squawking indignantly. "Good," Caleb said. "Now, collect the eggs." Collecting eggs turned out to be like negotiating with tiny feathered dictators. Each hen had her own personality, her own preferred nest, her own level of aggression about being disturbed. Mara got pecked twice, nearly dropped a basket full of eggs once, and learned more creative cursing from Caleb in 10 minutes than she'd heard in her entire life. But she collected the eggs. When she emerged from the coop, sweating and spotted with feathers, Caleb was leaning against the fence watching her. "Not bad for your first time." "I got pecked." "Everyone gets pecked. You kept going. That's what matters." He took the basket and headed toward the house. Mara followed, trying not to limp from the pain in her legs. Inside, Caleb set the eggs on the counter and started preparing a proper meal. Bacon from the cold cellar, eggs from the basket, leftover biscuits he heated on the stove. He worked efficiently, his movements precise and economical. "You cook?" Mara asked. "Had to learn after Sarah died." The name hung in the air between them. Sarah, the dead wife, the woman whose bed Mara had slept in, whose ring Mara wore. "How long were you married?" The question came out before Mara could stop it. Caleb flipped bacon in the pan. 5 years. What happened? Winter fever took her and the baby, both gone within 3 days. His voice was flat, factual, like he was reciting a weather report. "That was 3 years ago. Haven't talked about it since. Don't plan to start now." Message received. Mara fell silent. They ate breakfast in quiet. The only sounds, the scrape of forks on plates, and the occasional creak of the house settling around them. It should have been uncomfortable, but somehow it wasn't. Caleb didn't seem to need conversation the way most people did. Didn't feel compelled to fill silence with meaningless words. After breakfast, he stood and collected the plates. "You wash. I'll teach you about the horses." The horses proved more complicated than the chickens. Caleb kept 5. His buckskin gelding, named Buck, 2 working mares, a younger gelding he was training, and an old bay mare who'd retired from ranch work but was good for riding lessons. "This is Molly," Caleb said, leading the bay mare out of the barn. "She's patient, perfect for someone learning." "I know how to ride," Mara protested. "You know how to sit on a horse and hope it goes where you want. That's not riding, that's being cargo." He showed her how to properly saddle Molly, pointing out every buckle and strap, explaining why each piece mattered. Then he demonstrated mounting from both sides, sitting balanced, holding the reins with the right amount of tension. Too loose. The horse thinks you're not paying attention. Too tight. You're telling her you're scared. Either way, you lose control. Mara tried to copy his movements. Failed. Tried again. Failed better. "You're thinking too much," Caleb said. "Your body knows what to do. You just have to stop telling it not to." "That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't have to make sense. Just has to work." He made her practice mounting and dismounting 20 times, then holding the reins properly, then sitting balanced while Molly stood still. By the time he let her actually move the horse, Mara's legs were shaking again, and sweat was running down her spine despite the cool morning air. But when Molly finally walked forward at her command, responding to the subtle pressure of Mara's legs and the gentle pull of the reins, something shifted inside her chest. The horse was listening to her. An animal weighing 10 times what she did was doing what she asked because she'd asked correctly. "Better," Caleb said, walking alongside. Do it again. They spent 2 hours in the corral, Molly walking in circles while Caleb called out corrections and adjustments. Stop slouching. Heels down. Eyes up. Gentle hands. Pay attention to what the horse is telling you. By the time he called a halt, Mara felt like she'd been beaten with a sack of rocks, but she'd also managed to trot, not just bounce around helplessly while the horse ran, for a full minute without losing her seat. That's enough for today, Caleb said, taking Molly's reins. Go rest. You'll be sore tomorrow. I'm sore now. Tomorrow will be worse. He was right. Mara woke the next morning feeling like her entire body had been replaced with one large bruise. Walking hurt, sitting hurt, breathing almost hurt. But when Caleb knocked on her door at dawn, she dragged herself out of bed and got dressed in the same ruined crimson dress because it was the only thing she owned. We're riding to the north pasture today, Caleb announced over breakfast. Check on the cattle, repair some fence. You're coming. Mara wanted to say she couldn't possibly ride today, not with her body feeling like this. But something in Caleb's expression told her he already knew how much pain she was in and had decided it didn't matter. So she got on Molly and followed him out of the yard. The ride to the north pasture took an hour. Mara gritted her teeth and focused on Caleb's earlier instructions. Heels down, back straight, move with the horse instead of against it. The pain didn't disappear, but it became something she could work around instead of being consumed by. The north pasture was beautiful in a harsh, windswept way, rolling grassland dotted with cattle, a creek running clear through a stand of cottonwoods, the mountains visible in the distance. Caleb rode along the fence line, checking posts and wire, occasionally dismounting to hammer a loose staple or tighten a sagging section. Mara followed, learning by watching. She saw how he tested each post by pushing against it, checking for rot or weakness. How he looked for signs of animal traffic, places where deer or cattle had pushed against the wire, bending it out of shape. How he moved efficiently, fixing problems before they became disasters. Why do you live way out here? Mara asked during a water break. There are closer ranches, places not so isolated. Caleb took a long drink from his canteen before answering. After Sarah died, I couldn't stand being around people. Everyone wanted to tell me how sorry they were, or how it was part of some divine plan, or how I'd find someone else eventually. He stared at the mountains. Out here, nobody tells me anything. The wind doesn't offer condolences. The cattle don't explain why bad things happen. It just is. Don't you get lonely? Every day. He said it matter-of-factly, as if loneliness were just another weather condition to endure. But lonely's better than suffocating under other people's pity. Mara understood that more than she wanted to admit. She'd spent her whole life drowning in other people's disappointment and fake concern, their well-meaning cruelty disguised as advice. They worked until midday, then rode back to the ranch. Caleb made a simple lunch, bread, cheese, dried apples, while Mara unsaddled Molly, trying to copy the efficient movements he'd demonstrated. After lunch, he taught her how to mend a bridle that had cracked leather, then how to recognize when a horse was favoring one leg, then how to properly store grain so mice couldn't get into it. Each lesson was brief, practical, delivered without patience or impatience, just information she needed to know, presented clearly, and then moving on. By evening, Mara's head was swimming with new knowledge, and her body was screaming for rest. She collapsed on the porch steps while Caleb went to close up the barn for the night. Patch the dog appeared from somewhere and sat beside her, resting his mismatched-eyed head on her knee. Mara scratched his ears absently, watching the sun set over the valley. This place was harsh, demanding, nothing like the relative comfort of her parents' house in town. But it was also honest in a way that town never was. The work was real, the challenges were clear. When something needed doing, you did it. There was no pretending, no performing, no exhausting dance of trying to be someone acceptable. Out here, survival was the only thing that mattered, and for the first time in her life, Mara was learning what that meant. Caleb emerged from the barn and paused when he saw her sitting with Patch. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something, then he just nodded and went inside. Mara sat on the porch until the stars came out, counting the things she'd learned today, feeling the ache in her muscles like proof that she existed in a way she never had before. The days began to blur together into a rhythm of work and sleep and work again. Caleb woke her before dawn. They ate breakfast, usually something simple, whatever they had on hand. Then came the work. Hauling water, feeding animals, riding out to check cattle or repair fences, learning 100 small skills that kept a ranch functioning. Caleb never praised her, but he also never mocked her failures. When she dropped a bucket of water, he just handed her another bucket. When she fell off Molly during a writing lesson, he waited for her to get up and told her to try again. When she burned dinner attempting to cook, he ate it anyway without complaint, then showed her what she'd done wrong. His teaching method was frustration and repetition and the slow accumulation of tiny improvements that eventually added up to competence. Mara's hands developed calluses. Her arms grew stronger. The blisters on her palms hardened into tough skin. She learned to read weather in the clouds, to spot a lame cow in a herd, to judge if a fence post needed replacing just by looking at it. She also learned about Caleb through observation, since he volunteered almost nothing about himself. He was methodical, never wasteful. He talked to his animals like they were colleagues rather than pets. He worked from sunup to sundown most days, but always stopped for proper meals. He kept the house clean but not decorated. He read at night sometimes, usually old newspapers or livestock journals, but never for very long. And he was alone in a way that had nothing to do with Mara's presence. She could be in the same room with him, and he'd still seem isolated, locked inside some private grief he'd learned to function around but never through. 3 weeks into her new life, Mara finally felt confident enough to attempt a full day's work without Caleb supervising every move. She woke before him, fed the chickens without getting pecked, hauled water to the troughs, saddled Molly by herself, and was ready to ride out when Caleb emerged from the house. He stopped in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, and stared at her. "You do all that yourself?" "Did I do something wrong?" "No." He took a drink of coffee, studying her. "Did it right." That was the closest thing to praise she'd gotten since arriving. "I'm ready to do more," Mara said. "Whatever you need." Caleb walked down the porch steps, looking out at the ranch. "You really want more work?" "I want to be useful." "You are useful." "I want to be necessary." The distinction seemed to land somewhere important for Caleb. He turned back to look at her, and for the first time she saw something other than polite distance in his expression. Maybe respect, maybe recognition. "All right," he said. "Today you learned to rope." Roping was harder than anything Mara had attempted so far. It required coordination, timing, strength, and a kind of spatial awareness she didn't naturally possess. Caleb set up a wooden dummy in the corral, a cattle head mounted on a post, and demonstrated the basic motion. Build your loop, swing overhead, release at the right moment, let the rope fly straight. He made it look easy. Mara's first attempt landed in the dirt 3 feet short of the target. Her second went wild to the left. Her third tangled around her own legs, nearly tripping her. "You're fighting the rope," Caleb said. "Let it do what it wants to do. You're just guiding." "That doesn't help." "Does if you listen." 20 attempts later, Mara finally landed a loop over the dummy's horns. It wasn't pretty, and it was probably luck, but the rope settled where she'd aimed it, and that felt like victory. "Again," Caleb said. She practiced until her arm was too tired to lift the rope. Then Caleb took over, showing her again, his movements fluid and natural, the rope an extension of his body rather than a separate tool. "How long did it take you to learn?" Mara asked. 2 years before I was decent, 5 before I was good, 10 before I stopped thinking about it." "That's encouraging." "Wasn't trying to encourage you, was telling you the truth." They broke for lunch, then Caleb announced they were riding to the South Ridge to move cattle closer to the ranch before an approaching storm. Mara followed him out, her confidence from this morning already feeling fragile. Moving cattle turned out to be an exercise in controlled chaos. The animals didn't want to move. They scattered when approached, or stood stubbornly in place, or decided to run in exactly the wrong direction. Mara and Molly were supposed to help flank them, keeping the herd together while Caleb directed from the front. Instead, Mara mostly flailed around while cattle ignored her, and Molly did her best to compensate for her rider's incompetence. "Stop chasing them," Caleb called over the sound of lowing cattle. "Anticipate where they're going and be there first." Easier said than done, but Mara tried and failed and tried again and slowly started to understand the logic of it. Not pushing cattle where you wanted them to go, but blocking the paths you didn't want them to take. By the time they got the herd moved, Mara was exhausted, frustrated, and covered in dust. But the cattle were where they needed to be, and the storm clouds were still hours away. "You did all right," Caleb said as they rode back. "Better than I expected for your first gather." "I was terrible." "You were learning. There's a difference." That night, the storm hit hard. Wind and rain lashing the valley, thunder rolling across the sky like artillery. Mara lay in bed listening to it, wondering if the cattle were all right, if the barn would hold, if this was normal or dangerous. Around midnight, she heard Caleb moving around in the main room. She got up and found him pulling on a rain slicker. Where are you going? Check the barn. Make sure nothing's flooding or loose. I'll come with you. Stay inside. No point both of us getting soaked. But Mara was already pulling on her boots, and the spare rain slicker hanging by the door. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, then just shook his head and led the way out into the storm. The rain was brutal, driving sideways in sheets that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. They made their way to the barn, Caleb checking the doors, examining the roof for leaks, making sure the horses were calm. Everything was fine. They'd made the trip for nothing. Could have stayed inside, Caleb said as they stood in the barn doorway, waiting for a break in the rain. So could you. It's my ranch. It's my ranch too now, isn't it? Caleb turned to look at her, water dripping from his hat brim. In the dim light from the lantern he'd brought, his face was hard to read. Yeah, he said finally. I guess it is. They stood there together, watching the storm rage outside, and Mara realized that for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like a guest or an obligation. She felt like she belonged somewhere. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Mara woke to find Caleb already gone from the house, probably checking on the cattle or repairing whatever damage the storm had caused. She went through her morning routine, fed chickens, hauled water, made breakfast, moving with an efficiency that would have been impossible a month ago. Her body still ached, but it was a different kind of ache now. Not the pain of unused muscles being shocked into action, but the deep tiredness that came from regular work. She was pouring coffee when Caleb returned, muddy and tired. 2 trees down across the north fence, he reported. Need to clear them and repair the break before the cattle wander through. I'll get the tools. They worked together all morning, cutting the fallen trees into manageable sections with a 2-person saw, then repairing the damaged fence. It was hard, sweaty work, but Mara found a rhythm in it. The back-and-forth pull of the saw, the steady hammer strikes driving staples into wood, the satisfaction of seeing order restored to chaos. You're getting good at this, Caleb said as they worked on the last section of fence. I'm getting less terrible at it. Same thing? Mara wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at him. Do you ever think about teaching me something that isn't work? Something, I don't know, normal? Like what? Like... She struggled to think of an example. Everything in her old life seemed meaningless out here. I don't know, how to preserve fruit or make soap, things women are supposed to know. Caleb hammered another staple, his face thoughtful. Can teach you that stuff if you want. Seemed like you were interested in the practical things first. I am. I don't know what I'm becoming out here. You're becoming someone who can survive. That's not nothing. He finished the fence and stood back to examine their work. Satisfied, he gathered his tools and started walking back toward the horses. Mara followed, but Caleb's words stayed with her. Someone who can survive. Not someone's daughter. Not someone's burden. Not the woman nobody wanted. Just someone who could survive. That evening, after dinner, Caleb pulled out a worn book from a shelf Mara hadn't paid much attention to before. He set it on the table in front of her. Sarah's recipe book, he said, has instructions for preserving, soap making, dyeing fabric. All the things you asked about. Figured you might want to look through it. Mara opened the book carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailed instructions, notes in the margins about what worked and what didn't. This was Sarah's knowledge, carefully recorded, probably intended to be passed down. Thank you, Mara said quietly. Caleb just nodded and went back to his chair, pulling out a newspaper that was 3 weeks old, but apparently still worth reading. Mara sat at the table reading through a dead woman's collected wisdom and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that Caleb had decided to share it with her. Over the following weeks, Mara began integrating Sarah's recipes into her routine. She learned to make soap from lye and fat rendered from butchered animals. She preserved vegetables in jars, following Sarah's precise instructions about timing and temperature. She attempted bread that actually rose instead of sitting in the pan like a brick. Some things worked. Some things failed spectacularly. But slowly, the house began to feel more lived in, less like a museum to someone who was gone. Caleb never commented on it directly, but Mara noticed small things. He started eating meals at the table instead of standing at the counter. He stayed inside longer in the evenings instead of disappearing to the barn. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions, where to move cattle, when to repair equipment, what supplies to order on the next town trip. She was becoming part of the operation, not just an extra set of hands. One evening, 6 weeks after the wedding, Mara was washing dishes when Caleb spoke up from his chair. You ever regret it? She turned around. Regret what? Saying yes. Marrying me. Coming here. Mara dried her hand slowly, considering the question. Did she regret it? Her body hurt constantly. She worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She was isolated from everything familiar, married to a man who was more ghost than companion most days. But she also wasn't drowning in her family's disappointment anymore. Wasn't performing an exhausting charade of trying to be acceptable. Wasn't waking up every morning knowing the day would bring 100 small humiliations disguised as concern. No, she said, I don't regret it. Even though I'm not much of a husband? You're honest. That's more than most people manage. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. You're not what I expected either. What did you expect? Someone who'd break easier. Mara wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation, but either way, it felt true. The woman who'd stood frozen in that church 6 weeks ago would have broken under this life. But somewhere between hauling water and learning to rope and surviving storms in the dark, that woman had transformed into someone harder to break. I'm going to town next week, Caleb said, changing the subject. Need to pick up supplies, check on some equipment orders. You want to come? Mara's first instinct was to refuse. Dry Creek meant facing everyone who'd witnessed her humiliation, seeing the pity or judgment or cruel amusement in their eyes. But then she remembered standing in the storm with Caleb, feeling like she belonged somewhere for the first time. Yes, she said. I'll come. Caleb nodded slowly. All right, but Mara, it's not going to be easy. People will talk, stare, some will be unkind. I know. You sure you're ready for that? Mara thought about the woman she'd been 6 weeks ago, terrified, frozen, drowning in shame. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming, capable, necessary, someone who could survive. I'm ready, she said. And when she said it, she almost believed it. The morning they left for Dry Creek, Mara woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. She lay in bed listening to Caleb moving around in the main room, the familiar sounds of him building a fire and making coffee, and tried to convince herself she was ready for this. She wasn't ready. But she was going anyway. She'd sewn herself a new dress over the past week. Nothing fancy, just simple brown fabric that Caleb had brought back from his last supply run. The stitching was uneven in places, and the hem wasn't quite straight, but it fit properly and didn't make her feel like she was being suffocated. That was enough. When she emerged from the bedroom, Caleb was at the table with 2 plates of eggs and biscuits. He looked up, registered the new dress with a slight nod, and went back to eating. Looks good, he said after a moment. It's crooked. Still looks good. They ate in silence, the weight of the coming day sitting between them like a third person at the table. Finally, Caleb pushed his plate away and looked at her directly. Last chance to change your mind. I'm not changing my mind? Once we're there, it might get uncomfortable. It's already uncomfortable. At least this way I'm choosing it. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Approval, maybe, or recognition. He stood and collected the plates. We'll leave in 20 minutes. Bring a canteen and wear your hat. Sun gets mean on the ride. The journey to Dry Creek took most of the morning. They rode side by side, Mara on Molly and Caleb on Buck, following the same trail they'd taken 2 months ago when everything had been different. Mara tried not to think about that ride, how terrified she'd been, how certain she was heading towards something worse than what she'd escaped. Now she was heading back, and the fear was different. Not the deep, drowning fear of the unknown, but the sharp, specific fear of facing people who'd seen her at her lowest moment. You're quiet, Caleb observed. Thinking. About? About what I'm going to say if someone asks why I married you. Tell them the truth. Which is? Caleb was quiet for a few strides. That I needed a wife for legal purposes, and you needed a way out of a bad situation. Nothing romantic about it, just practical. That's not going to satisfy anyone. Not trying to satisfy anyone, trying to tell the truth. They crested a rise, and Dry Creek appeared in the valley below. A cluster of buildings that looked smaller than Mara remembered, less significant. From this distance, she could see the church steeple, the main street, the scattered houses where she'd grown up feeling like she was taking up too much space. Her hands tightened on the reins. You all right? Caleb asked. No. Want to turn back? No. Good. Because we're almost out of coffee, and I'm not drinking chicory substitute for another month. The absurdity of that statement, facing down her past for the sake of coffee, made Mara laugh despite herself. Caleb's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile. They rode into town just before noon. The main street was busy, wagons parked outside the general store, horses tied to hitching posts, people moving between buildings on whatever business occupied their Tuesday afternoons. Mara recognized most of them. Mrs. Henderson examining fabric in the mercantile window, the banker's son sweeping the boardwalk, old Mr. Cooper sitting outside the saloon even though it wasn't open yet. The first person to notice them was Tommy Patterson, who'd gone to school with Mara back when school was still a thing she attended. He was loading supplies into a wagon and glanced up as they approached. His eyes went wide. He dropped the sack he was holding. "Mara?" he called out, loud enough that several heads turned. "Mara Whitlock?" "Mercer," Caleb corrected, his voice carrying across the street. "Mara Mercer." That got everyone's attention. Mara felt the weight of every eye turned toward her as she and Caleb rode past Tommy's wagon. She kept her back straight, her eyes forward, trying to channel the woman who'd learned to face down charging chickens and stubborn cattle. They stopped in front of the general store. Caleb dismounted and tied Buck to the post, then came around to help Mara down from Molly. She didn't need help, hadn't needed help dismounting in weeks, but she understood the gesture. He was showing the town that he wasn't ashamed to be seen with her. "You want to come in or wait out here?" he asked quietly. "I'm coming in." The interior of Harmon's general store was exactly as Mara remembered. Crowded shelves, the smell of coffee and tobacco, Mr. Harmon behind the counter looking perpetually worried about something. He looked up when they entered, and his expression went through several rapid changes before settling on professional courtesy. "Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer," he emphasized her married name carefully. "What can I do for you folks?" Caleb pulled a list from his pocket. "Need these supplies. Most of it's standard. Coffee, flour, salt, sugar. Got some specific items for tack repair, too." Mr. Harmon took the list and started gathering items from the shelves. Mara wandered deeper into the store, examining fabrics and notions she hadn't looked at in months. Everything seemed smaller than she remembered, cheaper, less significant. The bell over the door chimed. Mara glanced up and saw Mrs. Henderson entering with her daughter Emily. They saw Mara at the same moment she saw them. Mrs. Henderson's expression went cold. Emily just stared. "Mara," Mrs. Henderson said, making the name sound like an accusation, "I heard you were, well, I heard you'd gotten married to Mr. Mercer." "That's right. Rather sudden, wasn't it?" "Most marriages are sudden from the outside." Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened. She moved to the counter, positioning herself so she could keep an eye on Mara while talking to Mr. Harmon. "Emily needs new ribbon, the blue, if you have it." Caleb appeared at Mara's elbow, carrying a bolt of sturdy fabric. "This'll work for new work clothes, better than what you've been wearing." He said it loud enough that Mrs. Henderson clearly heard. The implication was obvious. Mara was working, doing real labor, not sitting around gossiping and judging others. Mrs. Henderson's face went red. The bell chimed again. This time it was Sheriff Crawford, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. He took in the scene. Mara and Caleb at the fabric section, Mrs. Henderson bristling at the counter. "Mr. Mercer," he said with a nod. "Mrs. Mercer, good to see you both in town." "Sheriff," Caleb acknowledged. "Everything going well at the ranch?" "Well enough." "Good. Good." Crawford moved to the counter, pulled out his pipe, and started filling it with tobacco from a jar Mr. Harmon kept for him. "Been meaning to ride out your way, actually. Check on how things are settling." "No need, everything's settled. Still, neighborly thing to do." Crawford lit his pipe and puffed thoughtfully. "You know people talk, Mercer, about that wedding, about the circumstances. People always talk." "True enough. Just want to make sure Mrs. Mercer is comfortable with her situation." The implication hung in the air. Was Caleb mistreating her? Was she being held against her will? Mara felt anger spike through her chest. "I'm perfectly comfortable, Sheriff," she said clearly. "My husband has treated me with more respect in 2 months than most people in this town showed me in 23 years. The store went silent. Mr. Harmon stopped counting out flour. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open. Even Caleb looked slightly surprised. Sheriff Crawford removed his pipe and studied Mara carefully. "That's good to hear, Mrs. Mercer. Real good to hear." He nodded to both of them and left, the bell chiming his exit. Mrs. Henderson gathered Emily and her ribbon with exaggerated dignity and swept out after him, but not before Mara caught the woman's parting glare. Mr. Harmon cleared his throat. "That'll be $18 even, Mr. Mercer." Caleb paid in cash and helped load their supplies into the saddlebags. They were tying the last bag when a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Well, look at this, the happy couple." Mara's stomach dropped. She turned to see Thomas Garrett standing outside the saloon, arms crossed, a sneer on his face. Two of his friends flanked him, his brother Daniel and a ranch hand named Webb, who had a reputation for starting fights. Caleb's whole body went still. Not tense exactly, but coiled, like a spring being compressed. "Garrett," he said flatly. "Mercer." Thomas stepped into the street, his friends following. A few townspeople stopped what they were doing to watch, sensing trouble. "Heard you and your wife were in town. Wanted to pay my respects." "You've paid them. Now move on." "Not yet." Thomas walked closer, his eyes fixed on Mara with open contempt. "See, I've been wondering something. Why would a man like you, who's got land, stock, a decent reputation, why would you chain yourself to her?" He jabbed a finger at Mara. "Unless there was money in it," which made me think about that land deal the sheriff was offering. "I refused the land," Caleb said. "So you say, but nobody actually verified that, did they? Seems to me you might have taken the deal and just kept quiet about it. Got yourself 60 acres of prime bottomland and a wife to boot." "I don't lie." "Everyone lies when there's enough profit in it." A crowd was gathering now, people emerging from shops and houses drawn by the confrontation. Mara saw familiar faces: the school teacher, the banker, the preacher who'd married her to Caleb. Her mother, standing on the boardwalk outside the dressmaker's shop, her expression unreadable. "The sheriff can verify I didn't take the land," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "One conversation at his office and this whole theory falls apart." "Maybe. Or maybe he's covering for you. You two always did get along well." "You're calling the sheriff a liar now?" Thomas shrugged. "I'm just asking questions people are thinking. Why else would you marry her? Out of the goodness of your heart." He laughed, and his friends joined in. "A man doesn't marry a woman like that unless there's something in it for him." Mara felt the words hit like physical blows. A woman like that. After 2 months of hard work, of building strength and competence, of becoming someone who could survive, she was still just that to people like Thomas Garrett. But before she could respond, Caleb moved. He didn't draw a weapon or throw a punch. He just stepped forward, putting himself between Mara and Thomas. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire street with the weight of absolute certainty. "I refused every acre of that land, refused the livestock, refused the cash bonus the sheriff offered to sweeten the deal. I married Mara because when I saw her standing in that church, alone, humiliated by a coward too weak to honor his commitments, I saw something none of you people have the eyes to recognize." The street was dead silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. "I saw strength," Caleb continued. "Real strength. The kind that survives cruelty without breaking. The kind that keeps standing when every reason to fall is screaming at you. Your town spent 23 years trying to make her small, trying to convince her she was a burden, and she survived it. That's worth more than 60 acres or 100 head of cattle, or whatever small amount of pride you think you lost when she married me instead of you." Thomas's face went red. "Now you wait a minute." "No, you wait. You stood in front of that whole church and humiliated a woman because you were too much of a coward to admit you cared more about land than honor. You destroyed what should have been the best day of her life because you couldn't handle the fact that she wasn't what you expected. And now you're standing here trying to salvage your reputation by making me the villain." Caleb took another step forward. Thomas actually backed up. "I don't need land to know my worth," Caleb said. "And I don't need to tear others down to feel big. But you need everyone in this town to believe I'm worse than you are. Because if they don't, you have to face what you actually are. A small man who made a woman's pain into entertainment." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, into that silence, Caleb did something Mara never expected. He turned to her, held out his hand, and said clearly, "Dance with me." Mara stared at him. "What?" "Right here, right now, dance with me." "There's no music." From somewhere down the street, a fiddle started playing. Someone in the saloon, probably, who'd heard everything and decided to help. The tune was slow and simple, carrying through the afternoon air. Caleb's hand stayed extended. "There's music now." Mara looked at his hand, then at the crowd gathered around them, then at Thomas Garrett's furious face. This was insane. They were standing in the middle of the street, covered in trail dust, surrounded by every person who'd ever made her feel worthless. But Caleb's hand was steady, and his eyes held hers with something she hadn't seen before. Not pity, not obligation, but genuine invitation. She took his hand, Caleb pulled her gently into the street, into the space between the crowd and the hitching posts. He placed one hand at her waist, held her other hand in his, and began to move. Mara stumbled on the first step. She was too tall, too awkward, too aware of every eye watching them. "Stop thinking," Caleb murmured. "Just follow." He led her in a simple pattern: forward, side, back, side. Nothing fancy, just movement in time to the fiddle. Mara's feet remembered what her mind wanted to forget. Her grandfather teaching her to waltz in the barn when she was 10, before he died and the music stopped and everything became heavy. They turned slowly in the dusty street, and the crowd watched in silence. Mrs. Henderson was there, her expression caught between scandal and something else. The sheriff leaned against a post, his pipe forgotten. Mr. Harmon stood in his doorway. The schoolteacher, the banker, Tommy Patterson and his family, Emily Henderson with her new blue ribbon clutched in her hands, and Mara's mother, still standing outside the dressmaker's, watching her daughter dance with the man who'd chosen her when no one else would. The fiddle played on, and Caleb led Mara through the steps with patient certainty. Her initial awkwardness began to fade. She found the rhythm, found the balance, found that she could move with him instead of against him. For just a moment, she forgot about the crowd, forgot about Thomas Garrett's cruelty and her mother's disappointment and the years of being made to feel like she was wrong just for existing. For just a moment, she was simply a woman dancing in the street with her husband, while the sun shone down and a fiddle played and the wind carried the smell of prairie grass and possibility. The music ended. Caleb slowed to a stop, but he didn't immediately release her. They stood there in the middle of Dry Creek's main street, still holding each other, while the echo of the final note faded into silence. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with the fiddle player. Mara could hear him clapping from inside the saloon. Then the sheriff joined in, a slow, deliberate clap that carried weight. The schoolteacher. Mr. Harmon, Tommy Patterson. Not everyone. Mrs. Henderson stood rigid, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Thomas Garrett had disappeared, probably back into the saloon. Daniel Garrett glared from across the street, but enough people were clapping that the sound filled the street, and Mara felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been sealed shut for years, finally allowing light to enter. Caleb released her and stepped back. He looked around at the crowd, his expression giving nothing away, then nodded once and turned to their horses. "We should head back. It's a long ride." Mara followed him, her legs shaking, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She mounted Molly with hands that trembled, and Caleb swung up onto Buck with his usual efficiency. Before they could leave, a voice called out, "Mara!" It was her mother. Ruth Whitlock crossed the street slowly, her face carefully composed, every step measured. She stopped a few feet from Molly and looked up at her daughter. "You're well?" she asked. It was such an inadequate question for such a large gap between them that Mara almost laughed. "I'm well. You look different." "I am different." Ruth's eyes traveled over Mara's new dress, her calloused hands, her sun-darkened skin. "You look capable." "I am capable." Her mother flinched slightly, as if the words had stung. "Your father and I, we believed we were doing what was best. When we arranged the marriage with Thomas Garrett, you were doing what was easiest for you." "That's not fair." "It's true." Mara gathered her reins, preparing to leave. "You spent my whole life trying to fix me into something acceptable, trying to hide what you saw as flaws, trying to marry me off so I'd be someone else's problem. But I was never the problem, Mama. I was just someone you didn't know how to love." Ruth's face went white. "That's not... I know you did your best, but your best was making me feel worthless. So when Caleb married me and treated me like I had value exactly as I am, it wasn't hard to choose him over all of this." Mara gestured at the town, at everything she'd left behind. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done." She nudged Molly forward before her mother could respond. Caleb fell in beside her, and they rode out of Dry Creek the same way they'd ridden in, side by side, but changed. Behind them, the town buzzed with conversation. The story of what happened would spread quickly, get embellished, become legend. By tomorrow, everyone within 50 miles would have heard about the mysterious rancher and his unexpected wife, the dance in the street, the confrontation with Thomas Garrett. Let them talk. Mara was done trying to control what people thought of her. They were a mile outside town when Caleb finally spoke. "You all right?" "I don't know what I am." "That was brave." "What you said to your mother." "It didn't feel brave. It felt like bleeding out in front of everyone." "Same thing, sometimes." They rode in silence for another mile. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of gold. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals, hunting. "Why did you really marry me?" Mara asked suddenly. The question had been building since the moment Caleb had defended her in the street, since he'd asked her to dance, since he'd looked at her like she was someone worth fighting for. Caleb was quiet for so long that Mara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, after Sarah died, I wanted to die too. Didn't try to kill myself or anything that dramatic. Just stopped caring whether I lived or not. Worked until I was too tired to think, ate enough to keep moving, slept when I couldn't stay awake anymore. That was my life for 3 years. Just existing. He paused, adjusting his reins though they didn't need adjusting. Then I walked into that church and saw you standing there while that coward tore you apart in front of everyone. And you didn't collapse, didn't beg, didn't try to make yourself smaller to please him. You just stood there and took it with your spine straight and your head up. And I thought, there's someone who knows what it means to survive. Mara's throat was tight. That's all? No. Caleb looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. I also thought, there's someone who deserves better than what this town is giving her. And maybe if I helped you, I'd remember what it felt like to care whether someone else survived or not. Maybe that would be enough to make me want to survive too. Did it work? Yeah, it worked. They rode on through the golden afternoon and something between them shifted. Not dramatically, not with declarations or promises, just a quiet recognition that they were becoming something more than a practical arrangement. The ranch appeared in the valley below as the sun touched the horizon. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb had banked the fire before they left, and it was still burning, keeping the house warm. Home. Mara realized she was thinking of it as home now, not as the place where she was staying until something better came along. This was home. This harsh, beautiful, honest place where work mattered more than appearance and strength was valued over performance. They unsaddled the horses together, moving in the easy coordination that came from 2 months of working side by side. Fed the animals. Hauled water. Checked the barn and corrals. When they finally went inside, Caleb built up the fire while Mara started preparing dinner from the fresh supplies they'd bought in town. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute. Fresh flour for biscuits. A bit of sugar for dessert. They ate at the table, the house warm and quiet around them. Patch lay by the fire, his mismatched eyes tracking their movements. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves. Thank you, Mara said as she collected the dishes, for what you did today, what you said. Didn't say anything that wasn't true. Still. Thank you. Caleb nodded and stood, stretching his back. I'm going to check the stock one more time before bed. Make sure everyone's settled after the storm last night. He pulled on his coat and hat and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Mara alone with the fire and the dishes and the memory of dancing in the street while the whole town watched. She washed the plates slowly, looking out the window at the dark shapes of the mountains against the night sky. Somewhere out there, Caleb was walking the property, checking on animals, making sure everything was secure, taking care of things, taking care of her, in his own quiet way. Mara dried the last plate and put it away. Then she picked up Sarah's recipe book and opened it to a page she'd been avoiding, the section on wool dyeing. Sarah had written detailed notes about plants that produce different colors, the mordants needed to set the dye, the timing for different shades. Knowledge meant to be used, meant to be passed on. Mara traced the handwriting with one finger, feeling a strange kinship with this woman she'd never met. Sarah had survived out here too, had built a life from hard work and practical skill. She'd loved Caleb, had borne his child, had died too young and too suddenly. But she'd also left something behind. This book, these recipes, this accumulated wisdom that now belonged to Mara. Thank you, Mara whispered to the woman who wasn't there, for sharing this, for showing me it's possible. The door opened and Caleb stamped his boots on the threshold, shaking off the cold. Everything's secure. Old Bessie looks like she might calve in the next few days, so we'll need to keep an eye on her. I'll watch for it. Good. He hung up his coat and hat, then paused, looking at the book in Mara's hands. You're reading Sarah's notes. Is that all right? Yeah, she'd want them used. No point in knowledge dying with the person who had it. He walked to his bedroll in the corner and started spreading it out for the night. Mara watched him, this man who'd saved her from humiliation and then shown her how to save herself. Caleb? He looked up. I'm glad you married me. Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or something softer. I'm glad you said yes. They stood there in the warm house, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside. Two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate loneliness and built something that was starting to feel like home. Mara carried Sarah's book to her bedroom and set it on the dresser. Then she changed into her nightclothes and climbed into bed, listening to Caleb moving around in the main room, settling in for the night. Through the walls, she heard him extinguish the lantern, heard the rustle of him arranging his blankets, heard Patch's contented sigh as the dog settled by the dying fire. And for the first time in her entire life, Mara fell asleep feeling like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Winter came early that year, announced by a cold snap in late October that froze the water in the troughs overnight and turned the morning grass white with frost. Mara woke to the sound of Caleb cursing in the main room, a rare display of emotion that got her out of bed faster than usual. She found him at the stove, trying to coax heat from wood that didn't want to catch. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. "Damper's stuck," he muttered. "Must have warped in yesterday's rain." Mara grabbed her shawl and knelt beside him. "Let me see." Together they worked the mechanism free, and within minutes the fire was blazing, pushing warmth back into the house. They stayed crouched by the stove for a few minutes, hands extended toward the heat, not speaking. "Winter's going to be hard this year," Caleb said finally. "Can feel it. We need to bring the cattle down from the high pasture before the first real snow hits." "When?" "Today. Tomorrow at the latest." Mara stood and started making breakfast, her mind already running through what needed to happen. They'd been preparing for winter for weeks, cutting firewood, repairing the barn roof, stocking supplies. But moving cattle was different, bigger, more urgent. "I'll need you on Molly," Caleb continued. "We'll push them down through the South Pass. It's about a 6-hour ride each way, maybe longer if they're stubborn. I can do it. I know you can. Just telling you, it won't be easy." By the time the sun was fully up, they were mounted and riding toward the high pasture where Caleb had moved the main herd for summer grazing. The land rose steadily, the grass giving way to scattered pine and rocky outcroppings. The wind was bitter, promising worse to come. They found the cattle spread across a wide meadow, maybe 150 head, grazing on grass that was already starting to die back for the season. The animals looked up as Caleb and Mara approached, then went back to eating, unconcerned. "We'll circle around, push them toward the gap," Caleb said, pointing to a narrow cut between two ridges. "Keep them moving steady. Don't let any break off from the group." They worked for hours, riding back and forth, turning cattle that tried to wander, pushing the herd forward with shouts and whistles and the constant pressure of being where the animals didn't want to be. Mara's voice went hoarse from yelling. Her legs ached from gripping Molly's sides. But slowly, stubbornly, the herd began to move. One ornery cow, a red heifer with a white face, kept trying to break away, heading back toward the high meadow like she'd decided winter was a problem for another day. Each time Mara cut her off, turning Molly with more confidence than she'd had even a month ago. "That's it," Caleb called from the other side of the herd. "Don't let her think about it. Just block and turn." By mid-afternoon, they had the cattle funneled through the gap and moving down toward the lower pasture. The hard part was over, but Mara's entire body was screaming. Her hands were frozen despite her gloves. Her face felt like it had been scrubbed raw by the wind. But she'd done it. Helped move 150 head of cattle across 6 miles of difficult terrain without losing a single animal. When they finally got the herd settled in the lower pasture near the ranch, Caleb dismounted and came over to where Mara was still sitting on Molly, too tired to move. "You did good work today," he said. "I'm exhausted." "That's how you know it was real work." He helped her down from Molly, and for a moment his hands lingered at her waist, steadying her. They were standing close enough that Mara could see the ice crystals forming in his dark hair, the redness in his cheeks from the cold. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching me all this, for trusting me to help. You earned the trust." Something passed between them in that moment, not quite a declaration, but an acknowledgement that what they'd built together over the past months was becoming something more than a practical arrangement. Then Patch came bounding up, breaking the moment, and they went back to work. That night, after dinner, Mara sat at the table working on a shirt she was sewing for Caleb. His old one had finally given up the fight, torn beyond repair during a fence-mending session. The stitching was better than her first attempts, more even, though still not perfect. Caleb was at his usual chair reading a 2-month-old newspaper by lamplight. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. Storm's coming, he said without looking up from the paper. How can you tell? Wind sounds different when snow's behind it. More weight to it. Mara set down her sewing. Have you thought about what happens if we get snowed in? We will get snowed in. Question is, for how long? And we'll be all right? Caleb finally looked up. We've got enough supplies to last 4 months if we're careful. Firewood's stacked. Animals have shelter. We'll be fine. Just the two of us. For months. That a problem? Mara considered the question. 3 months ago, the thought of being trapped alone with Caleb would have terrified her. Now it just felt like an extension of what they'd been doing all along, surviving together. No, she said. It's not a problem. Caleb nodded and went back to his newspaper. But Mara caught the small smile that crossed his face before he hid it behind the paper. The storm hit 3 days later with a fury that made the previous bad weather seem like practice. Snow came down so thick that Mara couldn't see the barn from the house. The wind drove the snow horizontal, piling it in drifts against the walls and doors. They spent the first day making trips to the barn to care for the animals, fighting through waist-deep snow, returning to the house exhausted and frozen. By the second day, Caleb had rigged a rope line from the house to the barn so they wouldn't get lost in the whiteout. People die walking from their house to their barn in storms like this, he explained as he secured the rope. Get disoriented, wander the wrong direction, freeze to death 50 feet from safety. The rope keeps you honest. Mara learned to follow that rope by feel, her hands gripping it tight even when she couldn't see more than a foot ahead. Learned to trust that the rope would lead her where she needed to go, even when her eyes told her nothing made sense. The storm lasted 5 days. By the time it cleared, the world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow stretching as far as she could see, broken only by the dark shapes of the ridgelines and the thin ribbon of smoke from their chimney. We're in it now, Caleb said, standing on the porch, surveying the damage. Won't see bare ground again until April. They fell into a winter routine, up before dawn to break ice on water troughs and feed the animals. Midday checking on cattle, making sure none were buried or lost. Afternoons repairing equipment, preparing for the next storm, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch functioning. Evenings by the fire. Mara sewing or reading from Sarah's books. Caleb working on tack or carving new tool handles from scrap wood. They talked more during those long winter nights than they had in all the previous months combined. Not deep conversations, usually, just the comfortable talk of two people who'd learned to exist in the same space. Caleb told her about the 3 years he'd spent working on a ranch in Wyoming before buying this place. Mara told him about her grandfather, the only person in her family who'd ever made her feel like she was enough exactly as she was. He used to take me out to check his traps, she said one evening. Taught me to read animal tracks, find water, navigate by stars. My mother hated it, said it wasn't proper for a girl. Your grandfather sounds like he had sense. He died when I was 12. After that, everything got harder, like the only person who saw me as something other than a problem was gone. Caleb set down the bridle he was repairing. You're not a problem, Mara. You never were. I know that now. Took me long enough to figure it out. Better late than never. One particularly bitter night in January, Mara woke to find the fire had burned down to coals and the house was freezing. She could see her breath in the darkness. She pulled on her shawl and went to build up the fire, trying to be quiet so she wouldn't wake Caleb, but he was already awake, sitting on his bedroll with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Can't sleep? She asked. Too cold. Fire's almost out. I know. Was about to fix it. They knelt by the stove together, building the fire back up, feeding it carefully until flames caught and heat began to spread through the room. But even with the fire blazing, the cold was relentless, seeping through every crack and gap in the walls. This is bad, Caleb said. Temperature must have dropped 20 degrees after sunset. Mara pulled her shawl tighter. She was shivering despite being right next to the fire. Your room will be warmer than out here, Caleb said after a moment. Smaller space holds heat better. You should go back to bed. What about you? I'll be fine out here. But even as he said it, Mara could see he was shivering too, his breath coming in visible puffs. Don't be stupid, she said. You'll freeze. I've survived worse. That doesn't mean you should. They stared at each other across the fire, and Mara saw the moment Caleb understood what she was offering. His expression shifted, surprise, then uncertainty, then something that might have been relief. You sure? He asked. We're married, Caleb. We share everything else. Seems foolish not to share heat when we need it. I don't want you to think I don't think anything except that we're both going to be miserable if we try to tough this out separately. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and gathered his blankets. All right, but I'm sleeping on the floor. The bed's big enough for both of us. Floor's fine. Mara didn't argue. She led the way to the bedroom, which was marginally warmer than the main room. Caleb spread his bedroll on the floor next to the bed while Mara climbed under her quilts. They lay in the darkness, listening to the wind scream outside and the house creak under the assault of cold. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for everything. For marrying me when you didn't have to. For teaching me how to survive out here. For never making me feel like I was something you settled for. She heard him shift on the floor. You weren't something I settled for, he said quietly. You were the first thing I chose in 3 years that felt right. Mara closed her eyes, feeling tears prick behind her eyelids. Not sad tears, something else. Something that felt like finally arriving somewhere after a long journey. I was so scared that day in the church, she whispered. Not just of Thomas rejecting me, of everything, of never being enough, of spending my whole life being someone's burden. You're not a burden. I know, you showed me that. Every day you show me that. The room was silent except for the wind and the sound of their breathing. Mara? Yeah? I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the cold air between them, simple and honest and absolutely terrifying. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known something was changing between them, had felt it in the way Caleb looked at her now, the way he found excuses to stand close, the way his rare smiles came more easily. But hearing him say it made it real in a way that scared her more than anything she'd faced so far. You don't have to say anything, Caleb added quickly. I just thought you should know. In case something happens. In case I don't get another chance to tell you. Why wouldn't you get another chance? Winter's dangerous. Accidents happen. Just wanted you to know. Mara sat up in bed, looking down at where she could just barely see Caleb's shape on the floor in the darkness. Get up here, she said. What? Get off the floor and get in this bed. If you're going to tell me you love me, you can at least do it while not freezing to death on the ground. She heard him hesitate, then move. The bed shifted as he climbed in, staying carefully on his side, a respectful distance between them. They lay there in the darkness, not touching, barely breathing. I think I'm falling in love with you too, Mara said finally. I didn't want to. I didn't think I could. But somewhere between learning to ride and moving cattle and surviving your terrible coffee, it happened anyway. Caleb laughed. A real laugh. Not just the small acknowledgement he usually gave. My coffee's not that bad. Your coffee could strip rust off metal. Keeps you awake, doesn't it? So would getting kicked by a horse, but I don't seek that out either. They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Warmer somehow, despite the cold pressing in from all sides. What do we do now? Mara asked. I don't know. I haven't thought past telling you. That was your whole plan? Tell me you love me and then just see what happens. Basically. That's a terrible plan. Got a better one? Mara thought about it. Thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, standing in that church in a crimson dress, humiliated and alone. Thought about the woman she was now, capable and strong and lying in bed next to a man who'd seen her worth when everyone else saw failure. We keep going, she said. We survive the winter. We work the ranch. We figure out what this is between us without trying to force it into something it's not ready to be yet. That's simple? Nothing about us has been simple so far. Why start now? Caleb reached out in the darkness, found her hand, and held it. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but gentle. All right, he said. We keep going. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped between them, the cold wind howling outside but unable to touch them in this small warm space they'd created together. Winter continued its assault through February and into March. More storms, more bitter cold. Days when leaving the house meant risking frostbite. Nights when the fire couldn't quite push back the chill that seeped through every wall. But Mara and Caleb survived it together. They shared the bed now, though they kept a careful distance most nights, aware that what was growing between them was still fragile, still finding its shape. Some nights Caleb held her when nightmares woke her. Some nights she held him when his grief for Sarah surfaced unexpectedly. They were learning each other slowly, carefully, building something that felt more real than anything Mara had known before. One evening in late March, with the first signs of thaw starting to appear around the edges of snowdrifts, Mara sat at the table writing a letter. Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. Who are you writing to? My mother. Caleb's hand stilled. What are you telling her? Mara set down her pen and read what she'd written. Mama, I want you to know that I'm happy, really happy, in a way I never was in Dry Creek. I've learned to do things I never thought possible. I've become someone I never knew I could be. I was never worthless, no matter how many times you made me feel that way. I hope someday you understand that. But even if you don't, I'm finally at peace with who I am. Your daughter, Mara. She looked up at Caleb. Too harsh? Too kind, if anything. She's still my mother. Being someone's mother doesn't excuse how she treated you. I know, but holding on to anger forever just makes me heavy. I'd rather put it down and walk away lighter. Caleb studied her for a long moment. You've changed since that day in the church. So have you. How do you figure? You smile now, sometimes, and you stopped living like you were just waiting for your own life to end. That obvious? To me, it is. He set down the harness and crossed to the table. He stood behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. You saved me too, he said quietly. I want you to know that. When I married you, I thought I was helping you. Turns out, we were helping each other. Mara reached up and covered one of his hands with hers. Good thing we figured it out. Good thing. The letter went out with the next supply run to town. Mara didn't know if her mother would read it or understand it or care. But she'd said what needed saying, and that was enough. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if winter wasn't quite ready to release its grip. But gradually the snow retreated, revealing grass that was somehow still alive underneath. The creek thawed and began to run again. The cattle ventured further from the barn, grazing on the first new growth. Mara and Caleb worked from dawn to dusk preparing for the season, repairing winter damage, checking on newborn calves, planning where to plant the kitchen garden. The work was endless but satisfying, and they moved through it with the coordination of two people who'd learned to read each other's intentions. One warm afternoon in April, they rode out to check on the herd in the south pasture. The grass was green again, dotted with wildflowers, and the mountains were losing their snowcaps, revealing gray rock beneath. They stopped on a ridge overlooking the valley, letting the horses rest and graze while they shared water from a canteen. Beautiful, isn't it? Mara said, looking out at the land spread below them. It is. I never thought I'd see a place like this. Never thought I'd be someone who could survive here. But you are. Because you showed me how. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, No. I showed you some skills. You did the surviving. There's a difference. Mara turned to look at him, this man who'd married her out of nowhere, and then patiently, methodically, showed her that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. I love you, she said. Not tentatively this time, not as an admission pulled from her in darkness. Just a statement of fact, as simple and true as saying the sky was blue. Caleb's face transformed, surprise giving way to something that looked like joy, an expression she'd rarely seen on his usually stoic features. I love you too, he said. He leaned in and kissed her, gentle and sure, and Mara kissed him back, feeling like she was finally, completely home. When they pulled apart, Caleb was smiling, really smiling, broad and genuine. What? Mara asked. Just thinking about that day in the church. How scared I was that you'd say no when I offered to marry you. How I had no idea what I was doing, just knew I had to do something. Best impulsive decision you ever made? Only impulsive decision I ever made. And yes, the best. They sat on that ridge until the sun began to set, talking about plans for the ranch, about next winter, about the life they were building together. And for the first time since that terrible day when Thomas Garrett rejected her in front of everyone, Mara felt not just accepted, but cherished. Not just tolerated, but chosen. She'd walked into a church as the bride nobody wanted and emerged as someone's burden. But she'd ridden away from that humiliation with a man who saw her strength, and in the months since she'd become someone new, someone stronger, someone who'd finally learned to choose herself. As they rode back to the ranch through the gathering dusk, Mara realized she wasn't defined by that moment of rejection anymore. She'd survived it, grown past it, become something more than the sum of all the cruel words and disappointed looks. She was Mara Mercer, wife, rancher, survivor, and she was enough. Summer arrived with a heat that baked the valley and turned the grass golden. Mara stood in the garden she'd planted in May, wiping sweat from her forehead and surveying the rows of vegetables that had somehow survived her inexperienced attempts at farming. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. Squash sprawled across the ground. Beans climbed the makeshift trellis Caleb had built. She'd grown food. From seeds and dirt and water and stubborn determination, she'd created something that would sustain them through the next winter. Not bad for someone who'd never touched a garden before, Caleb said from behind her. Mara turned to find him leaning against the fence, a rare smile on his face. 6 months ago, those smiles had been almost non-existent. Now they came more freely, especially when he looked at her. Don't jinx it. I still have to figure out how to preserve all this. Sarah's book has instructions. I know. I've been reading them. Mara pulled a ripe tomato from the vine and bit into it, juice running down her chin. The taste was warm and sweet and perfect. Here, try this. She held the tomato out to Caleb, who crossed the garden and took a bite from the same spot her teeth had marked. It was an intimate gesture, casual in a way that would have been impossible 6 months ago when they'd barely known each other. Good, he said. Really good. Everything tastes better when you grew it yourself. Or maybe you're just getting better at this. They stood in the garden together, sharing the tomato, watching the afternoon sun paint the mountains gold. This was what peace felt like, Mara realized. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of something worth struggling for. We need to go to town again next week, Caleb said, finishing the tomato and wiping his hands on his pants. Supplies are running low, and I need to talk to the blacksmith about new horseshoes. Mara's stomach tightened. She hadn't been back to Dry Creek since that day in the street, the day Caleb had danced with her and defended her honor and changed everything. Part of her wanted to avoid the town forever, to stay in this valley where she'd found herself. But another part, the part that had learned to face down charging cattle in brutal winters, knew she couldn't hide forever. All right, she said, I'll come with you. You sure? No, but I'm coming anyway. The ride to Dry Creek a week later felt different from the first time. Mara sat straighter in the saddle. Her hands on the reins were confident rather than desperate. She wore a dress she'd made herself, practical and well-fitted, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She looked like a rancher's wife. She felt like one too. As they approached the town, Caleb reached over and took her hand briefly. Whatever happens, we face it together. Together, Mara agreed. The main street was busy with mid-morning traffic. People turned to look as they rode in, and Mara saw recognition flash across multiple faces. Mrs. Henderson, the sheriff, Tommy Patterson. But this time the looks weren't filled with pity or judgment. They were cautious, curious, some even respectful. They dismounted in front of the general store, and Mr. Harmon came out to greet them, wiping his hands on his apron. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, good to see you both. His tone was genuinely warm. What can I get for you today? Caleb handed him the supply list while Mara wandered the store, examining fabric and notions. She was comparing 2 different colors of thread when a familiar voice spoke behind her. Mara. She turned to find her sister Catherine standing in the aisle, holding a basket of shopping. Catherine looked older somehow, more tired, though only 6 months had passed. Catherine. They stared at each other across the space between them, years of shared history and recent distance making the moment awkward. You look well, Catherine said finally. Different. I am different. I heard about what happened. In the street. When you were here last. Catherine glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Thomas Garrett left town, went to live with his brother in Colorado. People said he couldn't handle the shame of what Mr. Mercer said about him. Good. Catherine's eyes widened slightly at the bluntness of Mara's response. You're really happy? Out there on that ranch? Happier than I ever was here. Even though it's so hard? Even though you have to work like a man? Mara almost laughed. Especially because of that. I'd rather work hard and be valued than sit idle and be tolerated. Catherine looked down at her basket. Mother got your letter. Did she read it? She read it. I don't know if she understood it. She won't talk about it, but she read it. Catherine hesitated, then added, Father wanted me to tell you, if I saw you, that you're still welcome to visit, if you want to. Tell him I appreciate that, but I don't think I'm ready. Maybe someday. I understand. Catherine took a step closer, lowering her voice. I'm engaged to the banker's son, Robert. Congratulations, Thank you. It's a good match. Practical. He needs a wife, and I need... She trailed off, and Mara saw something desperate in her sister's eyes. I need to get out of that house, too. The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. Catherine was following the same path Mara had been pushed toward, marrying for escape rather than love, hoping practicality would be enough.
I hope you find happiness with him, Mara said, and meant it. Real happiness, not just tolerable existence.
Is that what you found? Real happiness? Yes. But I had to stop being who everyone else wanted me to be first. I had to learn that I was enough exactly as I am. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I'm brave enough for that. You're braver than you think. You survived the same house I did. They stood there in the aisle of Harmon's General Store, two sisters who'd been shaped by the same cruel mold but had emerged different, one still trying to fit into acceptable spaces, the other having broken free entirely. Take care of yourself, Catherine, Mara said gently. You too, Mara. Mara left the store and found Caleb loading supplies into their saddlebags. He looked up as she approached. You all right? I saw Catherine. She's engaged. That good or bad? I don't know yet. Depends on whether she chooses it or just accepts it. They finished loading the supplies in silence. As they prepared to mount up, Sheriff Crawford appeared from across the street, walking toward them with deliberate purpose. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, got a minute? What do you need, Sheriff? Caleb's tone was neutral, but cautious. Wanted to tell you something about that day you married, the land deal. Crawford pulled out his pipe and began filling it. I've been telling people what actually happened. How you refused every acre, every animal, every dollar. How you married Miss Whitlock, Mrs. Mercer, without taking payment of any kind. Why would you do that? Mara asked. Because people should know the truth. Thomas Garrett spent months spreading rumors that you two conspired for profit. Figured it was time to set the record straight. He lit his pipe and puffed thoughtfully. Not everyone believes me. Some folks would rather think the worst, but enough believe me that the gossip's dying down. We don't need anyone's approval, Caleb said. I know, but truth matters, even when you don't need it to. Crawford nodded to both of them. You two are good people. Wanted you to know someone in this town recognizes that. He walked away, leaving Mara and Caleb standing in the street. That was unexpected, Mara said. People surprise you sometimes. They mounted their horses and were about to leave when Mara caught sight of her mother standing outside the dressmaker's shop. Ruth Whitlock watched her daughter with an expression Mara couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe, or resignation, or something more complicated than either. Mara could have ridden past without acknowledging her. Could have turned away like her mother had turned away from her so many times. But she found she didn't want to. Not because she owed her mother anything, but because she'd learned something her mother never had. That strength came from choosing kindness even when cruelty would be easier. She guided Molly closer to where her mother stood. Hello, Mama. Ruth's hands twisted in her apron. Mara, I got your letter. Mara hadn't sent one. What did it say? It said you were happy, that you'd become someone you didn't know you could be. Ruth's voice was quiet, strained. It said I made you feel worthless. You did, for most of my life. Her mother flinched but didn't look away. I thought I was helping. I thought if I could just make you smaller, more acceptable, more like what men wanted, you'd have an easier life. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself from the embarrassment of having a daughter who didn't fit the mold. You're right. The admission seemed to cost Ruth something significant. I was. And I'm sorry for that. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now, what I did to you. And I'm sorry. Mara looked down at her mother from horseback, literally looking down for the first time in her life, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but maybe the beginning of letting go. I'm not ready to forgive you, Mama. Maybe I never will be. But I'm done being angry about it. I'm done letting what you thought of me define what I think of myself. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. Ruth nodded slowly, tears running down her weathered face. You look strong. Capable. Nothing like the girl you were. I was always strong. You just couldn't see it. I see it now. Mara gathered her reins, preparing to leave. Goodbye, Mama. Goodbye, Mara. Be happy. I already am. She turned Molly away and rode to where Caleb was waiting at the edge of town. He fell in beside her without asking questions, understanding that she'd tell him when she was ready. They rode in silence for the first mile, leaving Dry Creek behind them once again. Then Mara spoke. She apologized. Your mother? Yes. I don't know if it changes anything, but she apologized. Does it matter?
Whether it changes anything? Mara thought about that. No, I don't think it does. I've already changed. What she does or doesn't do can't touch that anymore. Good.
They rode through the golden afternoon, the mountains rising ahead of them, the valleys spread out below. This land that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when Mara first arrived now felt like the only honest place she'd ever known. It demanded hard work, but gave back in equal measure. It didn't care about appearance or acceptability. It only cared about survival, and Mara had learned she was very good at surviving. As the ranch came into view, Patch came bounding out to greet them, his mismatched eyes bright with joy. The chickens scratched in their yard. The cattle grazed in the near pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney where Caleb had banked the fire before they left. Home. Not just a place she stayed, but a place she'd built with her own hands and sweat and determination. They unsaddled the horses and carried the supplies inside. Mara started preparing dinner while Caleb checked on the animals one more time. The routine was comfortable, familiar, the kind of mundane domesticity that would have bored her in her old life, but now felt like exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing it. That evening after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of orange and purple. Caleb had his arm around Mara's shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady reliability that had become her foundation. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different everything is from 6 months ago. How I was standing in that church feeling like my life was ending, and it turned out it was just beginning." "You ever regret saying yes? Marrying a stranger because you didn't have better options?" Mara turned to look at him. "I had better options. I could have refused you and walked out of that church and built some kind of life on my own. It would have been hard and people would have talked, but I could have done it." "Then why didn't you?" "Because when you offered to marry me, you looked at me like I was a person worth defending. Nobody had ever looked at me like that before. I figured anyone who could see my value in that moment might be worth taking a chance on. Was I worth it?" "You know you were." Caleb pulled her closer. "I think about that day a lot. What would have happened if I just stayed in my seat? Let it play out without getting involved. You'd still be living alone in this valley, and I'd be in Dry Creek being pitied by everyone who watched me get humiliated. But you would have survived it, eventually. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe. But I wouldn't have learned I was strong. There's a difference between being strong and knowing you're strong." Mara watched the last of the sunlight fade from the mountains. "You didn't save me, Caleb. You gave me the opportunity to save myself, and then you taught me how. Best thing I ever did. Best thing we both did." They sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Inside the house, the fire crackled. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. This was the life Mara had built from the ashes of her humiliation. Not perfect, not easy, but honest and real, and hers. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about for a while." "All right. When I married you, I thought I was trading one prison for another. I thought I'd spend my life trying to be whatever kind of wife you needed, performing another role that wasn't really me. But you never asked me to perform. You just asked me to work, to learn, to be useful in practical ways that actually mattered. And somewhere in all that work, I found out who I really was. Not the girl my parents wanted, not the woman Dry Creek expected, just me. Raw and real and capable. That's who I saw in the church that day. I know, and that's why I love you, because you saw me before I saw myself." Caleb was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "When Sarah died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd used up my chance at having someone who mattered. But then you walked into my life, or I walked into yours, technically, and you reminded me that there are different kinds of love. Sarah and I had something good, but what we have is good too, different but just as real. You don't feel guilty about moving on? Sometimes. But then I remember that Sarah would want me to be happy, and I am happy with you. In a way I didn't think I'd ever be again." Mara felt tears on her cheeks, but they weren't sad tears. They were the kind of tears that came from feeling too much, joy and gratitude, and the overwhelming realization that she'd somehow stumbled into a life worth living. "I want to build something with you," she said. "Not just survive. Build. Expand the herd. Improve the ranch. Maybe add on to the house someday. Create something that lasts. I want that too.
And I want, Mara hesitated, afraid to say it out loud. I want to have children, someday. Not right away, but eventually. I want to raise them here, teach them that strength matters more than acceptance, that hard work and honesty count for more than pretty appearances.
Caleb's arm tightened around her.
I'd like that. When we're ready. We might fail at parenting, at ranching, at all of it. Probably we'll fail at some things, most people do, but we'll try anyway? We'll try anyway.
They sat on the porch until the stars came out, planning the future they'd build together, and Mara realized this was what she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. Someone who saw her clearly, valued her honestly, and loved her completely. Not despite her rough edges, but because of them. The next morning, Mara woke before dawn and lay in bed listening to Caleb's steady breathing beside her. They'd fallen asleep holding hands, and his fingers were still intertwined with hers. She studied his face in the early light, the lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises, the scar on his chin from some long-ago accident, the gray just starting to show at his temples. He wasn't perfect. He was blunt and sometimes too distant and made terrible coffee, and had days when his grief for Sarah still surfaced unexpectedly. But he was honest, and he was hers, and that was enough. More than enough. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and dressed in her work clothes. Outside, the world was gray and still, waiting for the sun. She fed the chickens, hauled water, checked on the cattle in the near pasture. By the time she returned to the house, Caleb was up and making breakfast. "You let me sleep," he said. "You needed it. We worked hard yesterday. We work hard every day." "True." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, and then Mara said, "I want to ride out to the ridge today, the one where we first kissed. Will you come with me?" "Any particular reason?" "I just want to see the valley from up there. Remember where we started." They saddled the horses and rode out, following the trail that wound up through the grasslands to the ridge overlooking the valley. It took an hour to reach the top, but the view was worth it. The ranch spread out below them, the creek winding through green grass, the mountains standing guard in the distance. Mara dismounted and stood at the edge, looking down at everything she and Caleb had built together. "You know what I see when I look at this?" she asked. "What?" "Proof that I survived. Proof that I'm strong enough to build something real. Proof that the woman who got rejected in that church isn't who I am anymore. She never was who you are. She was just who they tried to make you." "Maybe. But I had to come here to figure that out." Caleb came to stand beside her, and they looked down at their life together. Small, but significant. Hard-won, but worth every struggle. "I need to tell you something," Mara said. "Something I should have said a long time ago." "What's that?" "Thank you. For marrying me, for teaching me, for loving me when I didn't know how to love myself. Thank you for seeing something in me worth defending, worth building a life with. You gave me a chance to become someone I could be proud of. You did that yourself." "No, we did it together, and that's what makes it real." She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "I was never worthless. I know that now. It took coming here, learning to survive, finding you, but I finally know it. I was never the problem. I was just surrounded by people who needed me to be small so they could feel big. And now? Now I'm surrounded by grass and wind and cattle and you, and I feel bigger than I ever did in town. Not because anyone made me feel that way, but because I built it myself." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood on the ridge overlooking their life together. Below them, the ranch waited, work to be done, cattle to be moved, fences to be repaired, a life to be lived. It wasn't perfect. Some days would be harder than others. Some years would bring drought or disease or disaster. They would argue and disagree and struggle with the same challenges everyone faced when building something lasting. But they would face it together. Two people who'd found each other in the worst moment of their lives and turned it into the beginning of something better. Mara thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, terrified, humiliated, certain she would spend her life being whatever disappointing thing other people saw when they looked at her. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone Mara had once known but no longer recognized. She'd crossed humiliation and wilderness and fear and emerged on the other side as someone stronger than the entire town that had tried to bury her. Someone capable. Someone necessary. Someone who'd finally learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. She was Mara Mercer, and she was enough. The sun climbed higher, warming the valley, and Mara knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone had chosen her, but because she'd chosen herself. Not because she fit some acceptable mold, but because she'd broken that mold entirely and created her own shape. This was freedom. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice. The knowledge that she could survive anything because she'd already survived everything meant to destroy her. "Ready to head back?" Caleb asked. "Yes, we have work to do." They mounted their horses and rode down from the ridge together, leaving the pass behind them and riding toward a future they'd build with their own hands. And as the ranch came into view below them, small but strong, hard-won but lasting, Mara smiled. She was home. She was happy. She was exactly who she was supposed to be. And that was more than enough.